High-speed rail systems have been around for decades, and the speeds that the trains travel at have been increasing over time, and new countries have been jumping into developing new systems. And in the U.S., we still have high-speed rail. Well, it's a little faster than this. This is what we have now in the Northeast Corridor between Washington, D.C. and Boston, where in a couple of sections, the trains can get up to speeds of 150 miles an hour now. And a new system opened up recently in South Florida, Brightline, and its maximum speeds are 125 miles an hour. And Amtrak has purchased new Acela trains for the Northeast Corridor that will be able to get up to 160 miles an hour. In California, a system is being built, a high-speed rail system that will be able to go 220 miles an hour. And the goal is to go from San Francisco to LA in under 3 hours. And that's a lot faster than the current situation where the Amtrak Coast Starlight train, which can reach top speeds of 79 miles an hour, which is rare, it takes 11 to 12 hours to go from Oakland in the San Francisco Bay Area to Los Angeles. And I've seen things other places where it was less time than that, but this is the schedule from the National Rail Passengers Association that puts together timetables of all the Amtrak trains. So the Coast Starlight, as its name implies, goes pretty much down the coast down to Los Angeles. And the new California high-speed rail system would go inland after going south from San Jose. Then it'll cut through mountains and over to the Central Valley and down. So it seems like roughly the same distance, but it'll be a lot faster. And it actually is being built in the Central Valley. This is one of the huge viaducts that are under construction to go over highways and in some cases rivers in the Central Valley. There's another viaduct that's been completed. They haven't put track down on any of the viaducts or the right-of-way that they've built, but that is coming up in the next couple of years. And the overhead wires, the catenary wires that the trains run on. So one of the things with California high-speed rail is the cost has really gone up, and originally voters thought the whole system could be built for around $30 billion and it would be up and running by now or in the next year or so, but it won't be ready for many years into the 2030s, and the cost has ballooned up to like $130 billion for the whole system. And cost increases in rail projects are nothing new. This is the East Side Access project that now brings the Long Island Railroad from Long Island into the Grand Central Station, another station in Manhattan. The Long Island Railroad still goes into Penn Station in New York, but this allows commuters to save a couple of blocks of walking, but the cost went up from $3 to $4 billion up to $11 to $12 billion. So cost really increased, and the project finished way later than was originally thought. So various countries, especially in Europe, as well as in North Africa and in Asia, have high-speed rail systems, and Spain has a very extensive system that's been running in its original configuration since 1992, and it has speeds that get up to 193 miles an hour, and now they have 2,500 miles of high-speed rail that go all over the country. Spain is about the size of Texas. In France, the French high-speed rail network's been in operation since 1981, and it has speeds now up to 200 miles an hour, and it has 1,740 miles in operation of high-speed rail, and more is in construction. Germany, they've had a high-speed rail system since 1991, and their maximum speed's 186 miles an hour. They have more than 1,000 miles of high-speed rail. Japan, the Shinkansen high-speed rail system since 1962, going all the way back a little more than 60 years, and its maximum speeds are 200 miles an hour, and they have about 1,800 or so miles of high-speed rail, and more is under construction that'll bring them up to around 2,000. Not to be outdone, South Korea, they have a high-speed rail system that's been in operation since 2004. Some really sleek trains and long concrete viaducts. Their system is about 400 miles, and their trains get up to 200 miles an hour. Nobody outdoes China, though. China just got into the High-Speed Rail Act fairly recently, just since 2007, and they have the trains that go the fastest, up to 240 miles an hour, and they've built 28,000 miles. Just amazing. So one of the topics that comes up a lot with high-speed rail is, where do we get the funding for it? Can the federal government supply funding to help build these systems in the various states? A lot is counted on the states themselves to supply funding, but what about the federal government? That seems to be who funds the high-speed rail systems in other countries. And in various videos, when it's talked about how come we don't have better housing or how come we don't have better transportation, it often is brought up, why do we give so much money to foreign countries in foreign aid when we could be spending it at home? So I looked up how much we do spend each year on foreign aid, and it adds up to $70 billion a year. And you can see here that Ukraine and Israel get good chunks of it, but a lot of other countries do too. And you might look at this as a possible area. Could some money be reduced to the other countries to help build high-speed rail? And you might not just want to look at foreign aid, though, as a possible place in the budget to sort of steer money from, but look at some of the other parts of the federal budget. The CIA has a $3 billion a year budget that we know of, could be higher. The National Reconnaissance Organization budget, it's a satellite agency, has a $6 billion budget. And then you look at all these numbers are dwarfed by even larger numbers in the federal budget. We spend $475 billion a year paying off our federal deficit, which is now up to $35.5 trillion, and we're adding to that each year, as I'll show below. The defense budget is more than $700 billion, and a lot of that is used to protect other parts of the world. And then some things that you just could not possibly touch because people have paid into the system and are dependent on it. Our Social Security is $1.2 trillion, and Medicare and Medicaid is more than $1.3 trillion. So it all adds up to a total federal budget of more than $6 trillion. And even with all that, that's more than the revenue that is expected to be coming in, to the tune of around $5 trillion. So we're adding $1 trillion of debt each year at the current pace. And that just will increase the amount of interest we have to pay on the federal deficit every year. So when you're spending money on things like interest on the federal debt or foreign aid, that just means there's less money for spending on infrastructure at home in the U.S. So a lot of times when projects are proposed and state agencies are planning and trying to get federal funding, they sort of talk about it like it's a risk of how much they'll get, and it's really tough to plan without knowing how much money is coming. But there needs to be like an overall plan for the whole country so that the states know more about what they can expect to receive, so that planning and design and construction can happen more efficiently, and it also helps keep the costs down rather than dealing with uncertainty where you're stop go and you're wasting a lot of time and money due to inflation. Costs keep increasing. And then I wanted to look at, well, is there better news on the state side in terms of having enough money to help pay for high-speed rail projects or transit projects in general? But if you look at this chart, a lot of the states are in big debt, especially California, more than $500 billion in debt that they have to pay off. New York, almost $400 billion. And then on down the line, I knew that Illinois has a real budget problem. It seems like they've been skirting with bankruptcy. They have $165 billion in debt, and on down the line. So the states are not doing well either. So any of these high-speed rail systems are ever going to be built, it's going to be a heavy lift because the federal government's in debt and a lot of the states are in debt. So I mentioned that the California high-speed rail system, which is in construction, but doesn't know how far they can build until they run out of money. And it's a question of, can the federal government step in a big way and help build that system? And California has a real auto-dominated culture where it would be great if it could take more cars off the road and use a more environmentally friendly form of transportation other than driving or flying. And their whole system, if it was completely built out from San Francisco down to San Diego, would cost about $200 billion. But other parts of the country deserve more in the way of rail systems. Some of the states are very underserved, and I'm thinking especially states like Ohio and Kentucky and Tennessee have very little intercity rail traffic, and most of the people have to drive. So on the theme of a rising tide lifts all boats, I applaud California for taking the lead and trying to be the first state out there to have high-speed rail. But other states should also have lines between cities in their regions too. And I list several possible lines that could be built, and taking my numbers from elsewhere and in some cases extrapolating when there are no numbers because no one's done any planning or design. I've come up with this list of what it might cost to build a more broad high-speed rail network in the U.S. that would have 7 different high-speed rail systems. And I should add also the one at the bottom of the list, Las Vegas to Southern California, which is also called Brightline West. That's a system that just recently received like a quarter of its needed funding from the federal government, about $3 billion, and the total cost is supposed to be about $12 billion, and it's supposed to be a privately funded system. Brightline, a private company, built a system in Florida that's now operating, not quite high speed. It gets up to 125 miles an hour, which is faster than cars speeding by on the highway next to it, which are going 70 to 90 miles an hour, but still not considered quote unquote high speed. But in Florida, they didn't request any federal funding. But to do the line from Las Vegas to Southern California, which is a heavily traveled corridor where a lot of people drive from Southern California up to Las Vegas or fly, and the total cost would be about $12 billion, and they felt like that was so expensive that they did need some federal support on that, and they were hoping for more, but they got a quarter of the funding. So we'll see if they can still build the line. They're supposedly supposed to start this year in construction, but I think they want to make sure they have their finances all lined up before they really get going. And the idea is to build the system so that it's in operation before the Olympics in Los Angeles in 2028, which is not that far away, so they've really got to get going this year if they're going to make it. So anyway, if you take these 7 systems, which I'll show in upcoming slides, it comes up to about 2,800 miles, and it would cost about $300 billion. And how does that compare to all the other countries we were talking about? Well, China's got a system that's 10 times as big as that, 28,000 miles. And as I mentioned, their trains get up to 240 miles an hour. And I mentioned Spain, Japan, France, Germany, and then there's other countries too that have high-speed rail. Saudi Arabia's got 900 miles, Italy 600, South Korea 400, Turkey has 250 miles in operation, and they're building a lot more. They really want to move up the list of these countries. And Morocco has an operating high-speed rail line, 200 miles long. The trains get up to 200 miles an hour. So here's 10 countries, and there are a couple more with parts of their lines that get up to high speed that are in operation, sometimes for decades, sometimes for half a century, and we're still lagging behind. So here's that Brightline West system I was talking about that would come down from Las Vegas. And ideally, the idea was it would go all the way to Los Angeles, but it gets really tough to continue to have a high-speed rail system in a dense urban area that's already built up. And other countries have the same issue where they've built high-speed rail out in the country, but when it gets into the urban areas, they have to slow down and use existing rail networks. So it's not high-speed rail from one end to the other. And that would be the case in California. You'd get off Brightline West and switch to the commuter rail system that would take you into LA proper. And here's what Brightline's trains look like in Florida. So here's the California high-speed rail system that I mentioned would be 800 miles if it was fully built out all the way down to San Diego, and total cost would be upwards of $200 billion. Right now they're talking just to go from LA to San Francisco, it's like $130 billion. So, and those costs could probably go up, and then there'll be the additional cost of getting down to San Diego and up to Sacramento. So here's some other systems that have been talked about by others, and one I've added myself, but the corridor that goes from Chicago to Indianapolis and then to Cincinnati, 300 miles, and the cost is estimated to be about $20 billion to be a high-speed rail. And so you can see for now, it takes an hour and 5 minutes to fly from Chicago to Cincinnati, but it takes longer to drive. Here's a system I don't think anybody's really talked about in this specific configuration, various configurations that would go to Nashville. So I've come up with a system that would go from Cincinnati to Louisville, down to Nashville, and then over across Tennessee into Knoxville and Asheville, North Carolina, and then to Charlotte. It would be about $18 billion, 600-mile long system. Charlotte to Greenville, South Carolina to Atlanta would be 250 miles, about $15 billion. Cincinnati to Columbus to Pittsburgh. Nobody's really been talking about that system. A lot of times they talk about Cincinnati to Columbus to Cleveland, but I think why not a line that connects Pittsburgh and Columbus? A lot of people travel in that corridor. High-speed rail system would help take cars off the road between those cities, and it would cost probably around $15 billion. And then I'm sure nobody's talked about this line, but I have driven many times between the New York area and Pittsburgh, and it's a long trip. It's like 7 hours to drive, and it could be cut way down if there were a high-speed rail line that just went right through the mountains, through tunnels, and made a couple of intermediate stops that put towns of Allentown and Altoona here, and just connect Pittsburgh to the New York area a lot better than it is connected now. It's a lot of driving, or the flights between Pittsburgh and New York are kind of on the high side. There's not that much competition in the airline industry between the city pair, so your main option is driving, and it's a long drive. And just to show you, you could take a train. You take a train, say, from Newark and then go down to Philadelphia, and then you switch trains, and then it kind of winds through Pennsylvania. It's not a direct route. It goes around mountains and into valleys, and it takes 9 hours. That would be a very long trip. So a high-speed rail system could really reduce that travel time. It would be a quarter of the travel time if it was built. And it would cost $20 billion, but it would put a lot of people to work too. A lot of out-of-work coal miners from Pennsylvania and West Virginia, they could be involved in the tunneling to have a straight shot. And right now there's highway tunnels in Pennsylvania on the Pennsylvania Turnpike, and a lot of people were employed back in the day. They didn't use the more modern tunnel boring machines to build the tunnels, and it could be that you could use a more labor-intensive type of construction. It might actually be cheaper than the high-tech way of using tunnel boring machines that are used today. And in this picture, Andrew Carnegie is standing in the foreground near the center of the tracks. So if you did have a high-speed rail in Pennsylvania, and rather than having California on the side, it would say Pennsylvania on the side. So this rather busy-looking chart is just sort of meant to show what kind of money would you need each year if you built these systems, if you got them going, say in a year or so, and you did planning and design for several years, and then you got into construction and you built lines. What kind of federal outlay would there be if all these systems were built at roughly the same time? And it still takes you out to 2036, and it still puts us way, way, way behind the rest of the world. But that's the kind of time frame they're talking about for California high-speed rail to fully build out the system. And the other systems aren't quite as extensive. They could be built faster. So California, if they were to receive a decent amount of funding, not even 100% of their funding from the federal government, but let's say 50 to 75% of their needed funding, they would need a roughly $12 billion a year. And they would need to know that this was going to be a steady source of funding, because without a steady source of funding, they don't really know how fast they can proceed. And you don't really have the goal, the end product in sight. So it's kind of tough to build when you don't know whether you're going to be able to build a whole system, or you're going to just have a minimum operating segment or partial system. But if you knew that the funding was coming in and would be coming in till the end of the project, it would be much better in terms of carrying out the project. So they would need about $12 billion a year. And then I did for one of the other systems, Chicago to Cincinnati, I just spread out what they would need in terms of funding. $1 billion a year, I say. And that adds up to a little more than half of the cost. I have a feeling that some of the other states are not as willing to support high-speed rail, and so you might have to increase the federal portion, maybe closer to $2 billion a year for each of these other systems in order to actually make sure that they get built. And so what would that mean in terms of a total amount of money that would be spent out of the federal government? Well, it would be about $18 billion per year to build a $300 billion system that would be in more parts of the country than just California. If you want to round, say $20 billion a year. So that's the kind of commitment that would be needed from the federal government. And it's a commitment that would be needed in order to actually finish something in a finite amount of time, rather than things dragging out over many decades or in generations and lifetimes. And if I've found that when the time frames are too long and the pace is too slow, it not only increases the cost, but people just lose interest and the systems never get built. You have to put a line in the sand and say, we're going to build these things by this year, and we've got to make that our goal. And it's got to be in the foreseeable future. I mean, 2034 or 2036 is still a long ways out, but if you line up the funding, if the Congress and the executive branch can actually get their act together and commit to a steady amount of funding for these various projects. That's the only way that they can get built. So going back to the 1960s, this is a picture of President Kennedy speaking at Rice University in Houston in 1962. And this is his famous speech given on September 12th, 1962, where he said, "I want to put a man on the moon before the end of the 1960s. That should be our goal, and we can do it. And it seems like it's insurmountable and very difficult and impossible, but if we muster all of our knowledge and our commitment, we can do it." And he was very warmly received by the crowd, very receptive. So unfortunately, he didn't get to live to see that accomplishment, but it did happen. In 1969, we sent men to the moon. So what seemed impossible in 1962 and seemed very hard, we did it. So in the U.S., if we look back on what we've accomplished in the past, we can do these things again. We just have to get together and commit to things. So let's go back and look one more time at the funding. This is where the money could possibly come from. Somehow, some way, we could reorient our priorities and be able to fund more high-speed rail across the country, $20 billion per year. So that's all I have to say on this subject. Actually, I could say a lot more, but I want to keep it fairly tight. And thanks for watching if you've watched here till the end, and we'll see you in the next video.